Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and brethren. In November of 1985, I was installed as master of this Quattro Coronati Lodge. That event being the start of the centenary year of the Lodge, my inaugural address was a review of what had or had not been achieved in the area of Masonic history, with some suggestions of what could be done in the future. I was slightly taken to task by some of the older members of the Lodge, being at that stage the youngest member of the Lodge in terms of age, in that I had had the temerity to suggest that we should not simply accept the writings of those we regarded as the greats in Masonic research, but should question their work and ourselves go back to the records they had surveyed to see if we came to the same conclusions. 30-odd years later, I stand by that view and firmly believe that we should periodically review what has gone before. In that, I share the views of Professors Prescott and Summers in their original paper for the Cambridge Conference and in its present iteration that historical research progresses by challenging received wisdom, re-examining the previous evidence, and reassessing it in the light of new evidence. It will not be a surprise if I say that I do not agree with most of the rest of what appears in both of their papers. From both versions of their papers, my reading is that they do not believe that the Grand Lodge came into being in 1717 because there is no contemporary evidence for it in the way of press reports, minutes, notes, or other documents, and that the only evidence available to us was written down long after the event and therefore not trustworthy. So let's look at what the evidence we have. The only evidence for the event on 24th of June 1717, as Andrew said, is Anderson's account in his 1738 edition of the Constitution. Professors Prescott and Summers believe that the story to be a fabrication by Anderson. They rather brush aside the suggestion that it would have been impossible for Anderson to have made such a fabrication because there were still people around in 1738 who would have been involved in the early years of Grand Lodge, not least Dr. Desaguliers and George Payne, who were still regularly attending, but come up with no convincing reason as to why Anderson should have invented the story. If the Grand Lodge had not existed before 1721, would not its revival in that year under the Duke of Montagu have been a much more glorious start than that under an unknown figure such as Anthony Sayre in 1717? I've said on many occasions in the past that I'm not surprised that there were no press reports of the 1717 meeting at the Goose and Gridiron. No major figures were involved, Freemasonry was little known, and had not drawn the attention of the press at that point. As Professors Prescott and Summers rightly state, the installation of the high-profile Duke of Montagu as Grand Master made Freemasonry a hot topic for journalists and writers. Having seen over many years what appeared in the press and in pamphlet form between 1721 and 1738, I am not surprised that there is no mention of 1717 and the Goose and Gridiron, as most of the press reports were of meetings at which leading figures in society were made Masons, or of the annual Grand Feast, or attempts to expose the secrets of Masonry, and the pamphlets were either exposures or rejoinders, none giving any sort of context or recent historical background to the subject. Suggesting that Grand Lodge was formed in 1721 and not in 1717 denies Anthony Sayre, George Payne, and Dr. Desaguliers their place in Masonic history as the first three Grand Masters, despite the fact that they were honoured as such throughout their lifetimes. I find it difficult to understand why our two professors should dismiss the evidence of the list of Grand Masters, Deputy Grand Masters, and Grand Wardens in the first Grand Lodge Minute Book as evidence because, in their opinion, it was compiled post-1731. I'm not an expert on handwriting or inks, but would be fascinated to know how they claim that the handwriting and colour of the ink shows that the list was inserted by Reed in the Minute Book sometime after 1731 and as possibly as late as 1738. There is no doubt that it is in the hand of William Reed, who was Secretary of the Grand Lodge from 1727 to 1733, The title did not become Grand Secretary until 1737, and he was making an official list for the record. The fact that none of the original three is mentioned as a former Grand Master in the Grand Lodge minutes until 1728 has a simple explanation. From 1723 to the end of 1727, the minute of each quarterly communication is headed by the presiding officers, that is, the Grand Master, Deputy Grand Master, and the Grand Wardens, or those who are acting for them if absent. No one else is mentioned in the minutes unless they spoke or were the subject of a matter under discussion. It was only in 1728 that the minutes began to be headed by a list of all the senior brethren present. Unlike today, when having served as a Grand Officer, you become a past Grand Officer and are entitled to attend and vote in Grand Lodge, the same did not apply in the early days of Grand Lodge. The introduction of the idea of past Grand Officers was slowly introduced in the 1720s. The minutes of the quarterly communication held on the 21st of November 1724 include the following. The question being put that all who had been or shall at any time hereafter may be Grand Masters of this society may be present and have a vote at all quarterly communications and grand meetings. Agreed, nem con. The same privilege was extended to those who had served or would in future serve in the office of Deputy Grand Master at the quarterly communication held on the 28th of February 1726. And finally, at the quarterly communication held on the 10th of May 1727, the Duke of Richmond himself proposed that the same privilege be granted to those who had served as Grand Wardens or who would do so in the future. This last factor possibly explains why Reverend Dr. James Anderson did not appear in the Grand Lodge after he had acted as Grand Warden, as only the actual Grand Officers and Masters of Lodges were entitled to attend and vote in the Grand Lodge. I find it equally difficult to understand why the letter to the Duke of Richmond, from the Duke of Richmond to Martin Folkes, now in the Royal Society archives, should be dismissed as evidence because it is undated, but probably dates from the 1730s. Its content is quite unequivocal. Folkes had apparently written to Richmond to borrow a portrait of the Duke to be engraved as a part of a planned series of portraits of former Grand Masters. The Duke responded, "As you say, our brethren will never be satisfied. How can fellows be such fools? Yet a positive negative I need not give, but I have too great a regard, you may say, to the Dukes of Montague and Buccleuch, and to those who were my predecessors, to have my print done first, but after they have got theirs, the Duke of Wharton, and the three that go before them, that is, Anthony Sawyer, George Payne, and Dr. Desies, for I insist upon theirs being done first. Then I will consent to your lending my picture, but positively not before those six are finished." In the 1723 list of lodges in the First Grand Lodge Minute Book, Richmond is listed as Master of the Lodge at the Horn Tavern, Westminster, now the Royal Somerset House and Inverness Lodge number 4, with George Payne as his Deputy Master. He was Grand Master 1724 to 25, and in the 1725 list of lodges, Desaguliers and the Reverend James Anderson are listed as members of the Horn Tavern Lodge. Payne and Desaguliers were clearly well known to Richmond. Why would he state that they have been amongst the predecessors of Grand Masters if they had not held that office? The comments about Stukely and his initiation seem to me to be a red herring. In his diary, Stukely simply records that he was made a Mason on the 6th of January 1721. His comments on the state of London Masonry are not in his diary, but come from his commonplace book at the end of an entry dated 5th of June 1726, in which he gives his reasons for leaving London and moving to Grantham. He felt greatly let down by those whom he had met in the various societies he had been a member of, particularly as none of them had helped him to any positions which would have provided an income. Perhaps his comments on Freemasonry had been affected by those circumstances. Equally, it is difficult to square his comment on the difficulty of getting enough brethren together to be able to make him a Mason in January 1721 with the fact that 6 months later it was reported that a great number of brethren attended the installation of the Duke of Montagu as Grand Master at Stationers' Hall on the 24th of June 1721. By that stage, in addition to the original 4 lodges, there were 2 newly created lodges who, if Stukely's comments were true, must have worked night and day to make masons to attend the installation. I am very familiar with the Book E in the records of the Lodge of Antiquity, having worked on it with the late brother Colin Dyer, probably the greatest expert on William Preston and his ritual system. We both believed that the list of members and the account of the Duke of Montagu's installation were contemporaneous with the events, but after comparing them with various examples of Preston's handwriting, that the excerpts from the early minutes of the Grand Lodge were by Preston, possibly compiled as an aid memoir, when he was putting together his case that the Lodge of Antiquity, as one of the parents of the Grand Lodge, retained certain inalienable rights with which the Grand Lodge could not interfere. I was aware of the passage in the report on the Duke of Montagu's installation in which it was stated that representatives of the London lodges gave up their independence to the Grand Lodge. I have always regarded that as a clever ploy by Payne and Desaguliers, having secured a noble Grand Master to move control from the individual lodges to the Grand Lodge itself, thus completing the work that began in 1717. They would both be aware that the lodges would not have surrendered to either of them as Grand Master, but a noble Grand Master was a different matter. We tend to forget the power and authority that aristocrats had in the 18th century. To the brethren of that period, the effect of having a noble Grand Master would be seismic and move the craft as an organisation into a different status. After more than 40 years of thinking about our development as an organised body, I'm convinced that 1717 did happen, and that what might have turned into a loose association with an annual feast was gradually turned into a governing body. I believe that Payne and Desaguliers saw an opportunity to create something bigger. Dr. Berman's paper goes into the reasons why, but realised that it needed major figures at the head if it was to have any success. With Payne's administrative skills and Desaguliers' contacts, they laid the groundwork which enabled the early noble Grand Masters, assisted by Payne, Desaguliers and others, to change the Grand Lodge into a national governing body. If one accepts the arguments put forward by Professors Prescott and Summers for Anderson's having been invented, the events of 1717 and what happened before June 1721, then one has to accept that there was a major conspiracy going on involving many people. Anderson may not have got all the detail correct, but his basic facts about what happened on June 24th, 1717, and the subsequent election and Payne of Desaguliers as successors to Anthony Sayre have not been disproved. I go back to my original question: why must evidence written down years after the event be suspect or discounted simply because of when it was written down? If the events before Montagu's installation of June 1721 were a fabrication, what was the reason for their fabrication? What we seem to be having is a semantic argument over what constitutes a Grand Lodge. In 1717, 1718, 1719, and 1720, grand feasts were held at which those present elected a Grand Master and Grand Wardens. They were not Masters and Wardens of lodges, but Grand Masters and Grand Wardens, which implies that the Grand Feast was considered to be a Grand Lodge. That it was not yet seen as a regulatory body is neither here nor there. It was something new and rather more than an ordinary lodge meeting. As I've stated above, the change from a Grand Feast to a Grand Lodge as we would recognise it today was a gradual evolution, carefully forged by Payne and Desaguliers, no doubt requiring great tact and skill to achieve. Montagu set the seal, but the development continued with his successors. Indeed, it still continues today as Grand Lodge continues to adapt itself in a changing society. What was given birth to on the 24th of June 1717 was the start of a continuing evolution, and that date is therefore rightly considered as the birth date of Grand Lodge.